The air in probate courtroom 3B was thick with the scent of old paper and bitter anticipation. On one side sat Tiffany Dubois, dressed in a black designer suit that screamed calculated mourning, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming on a crocodile leather handbag. She was the picture of a grieving, wealthy partner. On the other side, by the door, as if ready to flee, sat Annalise Brennan. Her coat was worn, her face was pale, and she clutched the hands of two wide-eyed, 5-year-old twins. She was the ghost of a past everyone had forgotten. All eyes were on Judge Peterson, a man whose face had seen every shade of human greed. He cleared his throat, lifted the last will and testament of the late Robert Coleman, and began to read. Tiffany smirked. Annalise braced herself. Neither of them knew the document in the judge's hands was not a will, but a time bomb. The polished wood of the courtroom benches felt cold and unyielding beneath Annalise Brennan. She pulled her thin coat tighter, not against the chill of the room, but against the frost emanating from the woman across the aisle. Tiffany Dubois didn't just look at Annalise. She looked through her, her gaze a dismissive sweep that catalogued the scuffed shoes, the faded jeans, and the weary lines around Annalise's eyes. It was a look that said, "You are nothing. You have no place here." Beside Annalise, her son, Liam, shuffled his feet, the sound echoing unnaturally in the tense silence. Her daughter, Lily, burrowed her face into Annalise's side, her small hand gripping a fistful of her mother's coat. They were mirror images of each other, with the same chestnut hair and, most damningly, the same piercing blue eyes as the man whose memory had summoned them all to this sterile room. Robert Coleman. Robert. The name was a scar on Annalise's heart. He had been her world, her sun and moon, before he became the storm that wrecked her life. Now he was just a name on a legal document, a source of wealth that Tiffany was poised to inherit like a queen claiming her throne. Tiffany's lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Mr. Davies, leaned over and whispered something to her. She gave a slight, confident nod, a flicker of a smile playing on her lips. She had been Robert's partner for the last 6 years, the glamorous woman on his arm at galas, the cohabitant of his sprawling penthouse overlooking the city. In her mind, this proceeding was a mere formality, the final step in transferring his empire into her deserving hands. The presence of the discarded wife and her offspring was an irritating, last-minute piece of trash that needed to be swept away. Annalise hadn't wanted to come. When the summons arrived, a stiff, cream-colored envelope from the law firm of Finnegan & Shaw, her first instinct was to tear it to shreds. Why dredge up a past she had fought so hard to survive? For 5 years, she had been a ghost. Since the day Robert had cast her out, pregnant and penniless, she had built a life from ashes. It was a fragile life, one of long shifts at a diner, late nights studying online courses, and the constant gnawing anxiety of paying rent on her tiny 2-bedroom apartment. But it was her life, and it was a safe one for her children. It was her neighbor, Miss Gable, a retired paralegal with a kind heart and a steel-trap mind, who had convinced her. "Annalise, this isn't about you or your pride," she had said, her voice firm over a cup of chamomile tea. "This is about those children. He may have abandoned you, but he is their father. The law has a long memory, even when men like Robert have short ones. You owe it to Liam and Lily to be in that room." So here she was, feeling as out of place as a dandelion in a rose garden. She had spent her last $40 on a simple navy blue dress from a thrift store, hoping to look respectable. But next to Tiffany's Chanel, she felt utterly invisible. Judge Peterson, a man whose weary expression suggested he had long ago lost faith in humanity, finally spoke, his voice a low gravel. We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Robert Coleman, who passed on the 12th of September. The document is dated the 10th of August of this year, a mere month before his untimely death. A month? Annalise's heart fluttered. Robert had always been meticulous, but updating his will a month before the high-speed car crash that ended his life felt deliberate. The judge continued, "The primary declared beneficiary and executrix of the will is Ms. Tiffany Dubois." Tiffany sat up straighter, the smug smile returning. She shot a venomous, triumphant glare at Annalise. This was her moment. "However," the judge added, peering over his spectacles, "Mr. Coleman's will is unconventional. It contains several specific stipulations and codicils that must be addressed before the disposition of the main estate." Mr. Davies frowned slightly. "Stipulations, Your Honor?" "Indeed," Judge Peterson said, turning a page. "Let's begin. The first article pertains to personal effects. To my associate and partner, Tiffany Dubois, I bequeath the contents of my wine cellar and my collection of timepieces in appreciation for her companionship." The word companionship hung in the air, stripped of all warmth. It sounded transactional, cold. Annalise saw a flash of anger in Tiffany's eyes before it was replaced by practiced composure. A few watches and some wine were nothing. The real prize was the estate, the penthouse, the portfolio of stocks in Innovate Dynamics, the vacation properties, the millions in liquid assets. "Article 2, the judge read on, his voice a monotone drone. "My property in Aspen, Colorado, and the attached land, I bequeath to my alma mater, Stanford University, for the establishment of a business ethics scholarship." Tiffany's jaw tightened. The Aspen house was her favorite winter getaway. Losing it was a blow, but still a minor one in the grand scheme. "Article 3, the judge said, pausing to take a sip of water. He seemed to be bracing himself. "This is the primary article concerning the bulk of the estate, valued at approximately $94 million. A collective intake of breath seemed to suck the air from the room. Tiffany's composure was gone, replaced by a greedy, feverish anticipation. This was it. Annalise just wanted it to be over. She wanted to take her children home, make them macaroni and cheese, and forget that Robert Coleman ever existed. She expected to be dismissed, to be told her presence was a clerical error, a final, cruel joke from a man who specialized in them. "Article 3 begins with a personal declaration," Judge Peterson announced, his eyes fixed on the document. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over Tiffany before landing, with a flicker of something unreadable on Annalise and the children. "He writes," the judge began, quoting from the will, "Legacy is not built on glass towers or stock tickers. It is built on blood. It is the only thing of true value a man leaves behind. While I have enjoyed the transient pleasures of my life, my most significant contribution, my only true mark upon this world, was not made in a boardroom." A knot of dread tightened in Annalise's stomach. This wasn't Robert's voice. The Robert she knew was a narcissist who worshipped at the altar of money and power. This sounded like a stranger. The judge continued, his voice gaining a dramatic weight. "Therefore, before any further assets can be distributed, the court must first officially recognize and validate my lineage. I, Robert Coleman, being of sound mind, do hereby acknowledge that I have fathered 2 children, a son, Liam, and a daughter, Lily." The courtroom was silent enough to hear a pin drop. Tiffany's face, moments before alight with triumph, had frozen into a mask of disbelief. Her head slowly, mechanically, turned towards Annalise. Annalise felt the blood drain from her face. She pulled her children closer, a fierce, protective instinct surging through her. But the judge wasn't finished. He held up a second, sealed envelope. This declaration is accompanied by a legal directive. Mr. Coleman arranged and prepaid for a court-admissible post-mortem DNA profile to be established. He further petitioned the court that, upon this hearing, a mandatory DNA test be performed on the children, Liam and Lily Brennan, to confirm his paternity beyond any shadow of a doubt. Tiffany's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is absurd. My client was Mr. Coleman's recognized partner. This woman has no standing. Her claims were settled years ago." "It is not a claim from Miss Brennan, Mr. Davies," the judge countered, his voice sharp as steel. "It is a directive from the deceased. The results of this test are, according to the will, the key that unlocks the entire estate. Until paternity is confirmed or denied, nothing else can proceed." The judge looked directly at Annalise. "Ms. Brennan, the court has a certified phlebotomist on standby. Are you willing to consent to a simple cheek swab for your children?" Annalise's mind was reeling. A DNA test. Robert, the man who had screamed that the twins were her burden and not his problem, had anchored his entire legacy to them. It made no sense. It was a game. It had to be another one of his cruel, intricate games. But then she looked down at Liam and Lily, at their innocent faces, their futures hanging in the balance. Miss Gable's words echoed in her mind. This is about those children. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she met the judge's gaze. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We consent." Across the aisle, the smirk was long gone from Tiffany Dubois' face. It had been replaced by the first, chilling flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. To understand the bomb Robert Coleman had planted in his own will, you had to understand the man who built it. Robert wasn't born into wealth. He forged it with a brilliant mind and a heart of ice. When Annalise first met him, the ice was hidden beneath a dazzling fire. He was a senior project manager at a burgeoning tech firm, Innovate Dynamics, and he moved with the predatory grace of a man who knew he was destined for the top. Annalise was a junior graphic designer at the same company, full of talent and a gentle optimism that Robert found refreshing. He pursued her with a singular focus, overwhelming her with grand, romantic gestures. There were helicopter rides over the city at sunset, surprise trips to Paris, and whispered promises of a future that sounded like a fairy tale. He made her feel like the only woman in the world. He told her she was the soft, human part of him that he needed to keep from becoming a machine. They married within a year. For the first 2 years, the fairy tale held. Annalise quit her job at his insistence. "To build our home, our sanctuary," he'd said. She poured her creativity into their new house in the suburbs, creating a space of warmth and love. He was ascending rapidly at work, becoming a vice president, and he would come home exhausted but exhilarated, his ambition a palpable energy in the room. Annalise was his anchor, his confidant. The change was gradual, insidious. It began when he was promoted to CEO after a ruthless boardroom coup. The man who came home was no longer just ambitious, he was conquering. The world was a chessboard, and people were pawns. He started talking about legacy, power, and dynasty, not family. Their conversations became monologues of his achievements. He stopped asking about her day. He criticized her for being too soft, too emotional. The man who once loved her optimism now saw it as a weakness. Then came Tiffany Dubois. She was hired as his new executive assistant, a woman as sleek and sharp as a stiletto heel. She mirrored his ambition, his ruthlessness, Annalise would see them on business news channels, Tiffany always standing just behind Robert, her expression a perfect blend of admiration and possession. At company events, Robert would keep Tiffany by his side, laughing at her jokes while Annalise stood alone, a forgotten relic of a simpler time. The discovery of her pregnancy was Annalise's secret joy. She hoped, with the naivety of a woman still clinging to the ghost of the man she married, that a child, a family, would bring him back to her. When the ultrasound revealed they were having twins, she cried with happiness. It felt like a sign, a blessing of abundance. She waited for the perfect moment to tell him, preparing his favorite meal, lighting candles. He walked in late, smelling of Tiffany's expensive perfume, and tossed a file onto the dining table. "I need you to sign these," he said, not even looking at her. "Post-nuptial agreement. A revision." Davies drew it up. "It's for the protection of the company." Her heart sank. "Robert, can we talk first? I have something wonderful to tell you." He finally looked at her, his eyes impatient. "What is it, Annalise?" "I have an early flight to Zurich." Her hands trembled as she placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "We're pregnant, Robert. We're going to have a baby." She paused, her voice full of awe. "2 babies. It's twins." She waited for the joy, the shock, the embrace. Instead, his face went blank. He pulled his hand away, as if her touch had burned him. "No," he said, the word a flat, dead sound. "What do you mean, no?" she whispered, confusion turning to fear. "I mean no," he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "This is not happening. Not now. This complicates things." "Complicates things? Robert, this is a family. It's what we always talked about." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that she had never heard before. "We talked about that when I was a mid-level manager with a mortgage. I am the CEO of a billion-dollar company now. My life is not this. A screaming, messy, domestic distraction." His eyes narrowed to slits. "You need to take care of it." The implication hit her like a physical blow. "Take care of it? You want me to?" "No, Robert, absolutely not. These are our children. They are your problem," he snarled, his mask of civility completely gone, revealing the monster beneath. "You think I'm going to tie my legacy to a ball and chain? You think I'm going to let this derail everything I've built?" The fight was brutal. It was the night the man she loved died, and a stranger took his place. He called her weak, manipulative, accused her of trapping him. He slept in a guest room for a week, and the only communication she had was through his lawyer. The day he threw her out was a cold, rainy Tuesday. He came home in the middle of the day with Tiffany in tow. She stood in the foyer, arms crossed, watching with a cold amusement as Robert delivered the final, fatal blow. "I've filed for divorce, Annalise," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The papers you signed last week weren't a post-nup. You were too emotional to read the fine print." He had tricked her, lied to her, using her trust as a weapon. "You've waived all rights to the marital assets in exchange for a one-time severance. It's already been wired." She checked her account later. $50,000. It sounded like a lot, but against his fortune, it was less than a rounding error. It was an insult. "You can't do this," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm pregnant with your children." He stepped closer, his voice a venomous whisper so Tiffany couldn't hear. "Prove it. You think anyone will believe you over me? I will bury you in court. I will paint you as an unstable gold digger. You will get nothing, and I will make sure of it." He looked at her stomach with pure disgust. "Those are not my children. They are your burden. Now get out of my house." He had security guards escort her out with nothing but a small suitcase she had managed to pack. As she stood on the curb in the pouring rain, watching the front door close, she saw Tiffany through the window, walking over to the bar to pour 2 celebratory glasses of champagne. That was the man who had written this will. Not a man capable of love or remorse. Annalise knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was not an act of redemption. It was an act of power, a final, masterful move on a chessboard only he could see. And as she sat in that courtroom, waiting for the DNA results, she realized she and her children were not beneficiaries. They were pawns. Leaving Robert's world was like being ejected from a spaceship into the void. One moment, she was surrounded by the trappings of immense wealth. The next, she was adrift, with no home, no job, and 2 tiny lives depending entirely on her. The $50,000, which Robert had intended as a final insult, became her lifeline. It was a cruel irony that his go-away money was the only thing that kept his children from being born on the street. Her first calls were to friends, the wives of Robert's colleagues, the women she'd hosted at charity luncheons. The calls went to voicemail. No one called back. The message was clear. She was no longer Annalise Coleman, wife of a CEO. She was Annalise Brennan, a liability. She had been excommunicated. The city that had once been her playground became a hostile landscape. With her pregnancy advancing, finding a job was nearly impossible. Landlords saw a single pregnant woman and saw a risk. After 2 weeks of living in cheap motels, her money dwindling at an alarming rate, she swallowed the last of her pride and walked into the Genesis Women's Shelter. The shelter was loud, crowded, and smelled of disinfectant and desperation, but it was also a place of surprising strength. The women there had stories that made her own, as painful as it was, seem like a paper cut. They were survivors of unspeakable violence, poverty, and loss. It was here that Annalise learned the difference between wealth and worth. She had lost her wealth, but in the shelter, surrounded by the fierce, resilient spirit of these women, she began to rediscover her worth. She met Miss Gable there, a volunteer who ran the shelter's job placement program. Eleanor Gable was a woman in her late 60s with a no-nonsense attitude and eyes that saw everything. She didn't offer pity. She offered a plan. "So the rich husband threw you out," she said during their first meeting, looking over Annalise's meager paperwork. "Happens more than you think. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Wallow or work?" "Work," Annalise answered, her voice hoarse. "Good." Ms. Gable nodded. "You have a background in graphic design. That's a skill. We'll start there." Ms. Gable helped her get a refurbished laptop and sign up for online freelance work. The pay was pitiful, but it was something. Annalise would work late into the night in the shelter's quiet common room, designing logos for small businesses for $20 a pop, the glow of the screen illuminating her growing belly. She saved every single dollar. The day Liam and Lily were born was the most terrifying and beautiful day of her life. She went into labor alone, taking a bus to the county hospital. The labor was long and difficult, but the moment she heard their first cries, the moment they were placed in her arms, 2 tiny, perfect, squirming bundles, the bitterness in her heart was washed away by a tidal wave of love so fierce it left her breathless. Looking at their faces, she saw Robert in the sharp line of Liam's jaw and the deep blue of Lily's eyes. For a moment, hate threatened to surface, but she pushed it down. They were not his. They were hers. She would be their mother and their father. She would be their everything. Life with newborns in a shelter was a new level of hardship. It was sleepless nights on a thin mattress, shushing crying babies while trying not to wake the other women, and the constant fear of them getting sick. But the twins were her anchors. Their smiles were her fuel. Their small, clutching hands were her strength. After 6 months, she had saved enough from her freelance work and a part-time waitressing job to rent a small, run-down apartment in the city's far suburbs. It was on the 4th floor of a walk-up. The heating was unreliable, and the paint was peeling, but it was theirs. It was a home. The next 5 years were a blur of relentless work. Annalise's days were a carefully orchestrated chaos. She would wake at 5 a.m., work on her design projects for 2 hours before the twins woke up. Then it was breakfast, getting them dressed, and walking them to the subsidized daycare near her apartment. From there, she would take 2 buses to her full-time job as a receptionist at a dental clinic. During her lunch break, she would answer client emails on her phone. After work, it was the long commute back, picking up the kids, making dinner, bath time, story time, and then, once they were asleep, she would open her laptop and work again, often until well past midnight. She was perpetually exhausted, running on caffeine and sheer willpower. There were moments of despair, nights when she would cry silently in the shower, the weight of it all threatening to crush her. But then she would look at the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, or hear Lily's infectious giggle, or feel Liam's small arms wrap around her neck in a hug, and she would find the strength to keep going. She never spoke of Robert. To her children, their father was a void, a question she didn't know how to answer. She told them they were a team, a family of 3, and that was all they needed. She was determined to build a world for them so full of love and security that they would never feel his absence. She slowly, painstakingly, rebuilt her design portfolio. Her work was good, and her reputation for being reliable and fast grew. She started getting better clients, bigger projects. The year the twins turned 5, she was finally able to quit her receptionist job and focus on her freelance career full-time. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was building. She had even started saving, a tiny nest egg for their future. It was on a rainy Monday afternoon, while she was sketching out a new website layout, and the twins were quietly coloring at the small kitchen table, that the letter arrived. The crisp, expensive envelope from Finnegan and Shaw felt like a grenade in her mailbox. Her hands shook as she read it. The news of Robert's death didn't bring her sadness or satisfaction, only a strange, hollow emptiness. He had become a phantom in her life, a ghost she had long since exorcised. The summons to the will reading felt like that ghost had returned to haunt her. "What is it, Mummy?" Lily asked, looking up from her drawing of a purple sun. Annalise forced a smile. "It's just a letter from a lawyer, sweetie. Grown-up stuff." That night, she called Miss Gable. "You have to go," her mentor said without hesitation. "You've spent 5 years being the strong one, the silent one. You've proven you don't need a dime from him. But Annalise, this isn't about need. It's about rights. Your children have a right to their legacy, whatever it may be. Don't let your pain or your pride stand in the way of their future." Miss Gable was right. Annalise had fought every day to give her children a life free from the poison of their father's world. But what if that world owed them something? What if, in some bizarre final act, he had decided to acknowledge them? She knew it was a long shot. More likely, it was a legal formality, a final I to be dotted on the closing chapter of her life with him. She expected nothing more than a formal dismissal, but for Liam and Lily, she had to see it through. As she entered the courtroom, holding their small hands, she was not the broken woman who had stood on the curb in the rain. She was a survivor forged in the crucible of hardship. She wore her thrift store dress like armor. She had faced homelessness, poverty, and despair. She could certainly face Tiffany Dubois. Back in the courtroom, the air crackled with tension. The phlebotomist, a gentle-looking woman in blue scrubs, had performed the cheek swabs with quiet efficiency. Liam had been brave, puffing out his chest, while Lily had needed a moment of her mother's reassurance before opening her mouth. The samples were sealed, labeled, and rushed by a court officer to the on-site lab used for expedited legal testing. The wait was agonizing. Judge Peterson called a 1-hour recess. Tiffany Dubois and her lawyer huddled in a corner, their conversation a furious, hushed storm. Tiffany's face was a thunderous mask of rage and disbelief. She kept shooting looks at Annalise that were pure venom, as if this was all some elaborate scheme Annalise had cooked up. The irony was that Annalise was just as bewildered. She took Liam and Lily to a small, empty waiting room, where she gave them the juice boxes and animal crackers she had packed in her bag. "Mummy, why did that lady take spit from my cheek?" Liam asked, his mouth full of cracker. "It's just something the judge needed for his paperwork, sweetie," Annalise said, stroking his hair. "It's all very boring grown-up stuff. We'll be home soon." She tried to project a calm she was far from feeling. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Why would Robert do this? Why, after 5 years of absolute silence, would he chain his entire $94 million fortune to a DNA test of the children he disowned? It couldn't be remorse. The Robert she knew was incapable of that emotion. Control. Yes. That felt closer to the truth. Robert always had to be in control of his business, of his life, and even, it seemed, of his death. Was this his way of reaching from the grave to manipulate them one last time? Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Ms. Gable. "Stay strong. Let the truth do its work." Annalise took a deep breath, the simple message a lifeline in her sea of anxiety. When the court officer called them back, the atmosphere in the room had changed. The bored indifference was gone, replaced by a palpable, electric curiosity. The court staff, the other lawyers waiting for their cases, even the security guard by the door. Everyone seemed to be leaning in, sensing that this was no ordinary probate hearing. Tiffany was back in her seat, but her earlier confidence had evaporated. She looked brittle, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of her expensive bag. Judge Peterson re-entered the room, holding a single sheet of paper. He sat down, placed the paper before him, and put on his reading glasses. He looked at the document for a long moment, his face impassive. "The results of the court-ordered DNA comparison are in," he announced, his voice cutting through the silence. "The lab has confirmed the genetic relationship between the deceased, Robert Coleman, and the children, Liam Brennan and Lily Brennan." He looked up from the page. "Paternity is established at a statistical certainty of 99.99999%. For the purposes of this court, and this will, Liam and Lily Brennan are now legally recognized as Liam and Lily Coleman." Annalise felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. It wasn't a surprise. She had never had a single doubt. But hearing it stated as an undeniable, legal fact in this room, in front of her, felt like a tectonic shift. It was the truth she had carried alone for 5 years, now validated by the cold, impartial power of the law. The twins. They were Colemans. A name she had tried to leave behind was now irrevocably tied to her children. Across the aisle, Tiffany Dubois made a small, strangled sound, a mix between a gasp and a sob. Her lawyer placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Now that the condition of paternity has been met," Judge Peterson continued, picking up the will once more, we can proceed to the main clauses of Article 3 regarding the disposition of the estate." His eyes scanned the page. Mr. Coleman writes, "Having now legally recognized my heirs, my blood, the primary purpose of my legacy is to ensure their prosperity and to protect them from the predatory and opportunistic individuals who will inevitably seek to attach themselves to wealth." Annalise watched as Tiffany physically recoiled, as if the words themselves were a slap in the face. The judge's voice was steady, relentless. "I have witnessed firsthand how money can corrupt and how loyalty can be purchased. The person I chose as my partner in life proved to be more interested in my balance sheet than my well-being. Her devotion, I came to realize, had a price tag, one she expected to cash in upon my death." "Objection!" Mr. Davies shouted, jumping to his feet. "Your Honor, this is character assassination. The deceased is using this document to slander my client." "Your objection is noted, Mr. Davies, and overruled," the judge said sternly. "A man's last will and testament is his final say. He can use it to assassinate whomever's character he pleases. Please sit down." Davies sat, his face flushed with anger. Tiffany was now trembling, her face pale with fury. Judge Peterson cleared his throat and continued reading from the will. "Therefore, to protect my true legacy, my children, from such corrosive influence, I must first dismantle the false one." He paused, his gaze deliberately moving from the page to Tiffany Dubois. The room held its breath. Annalise felt her heart pounding against her ribs. This was it, the reason Robert had orchestrated this entire theatrical performance. It wasn't about giving something to his children. It was about taking something away from Tiffany. The judge read the next line, his voice clear and final. "I hereby declare any and all previous articles, bequests, promises, or entitlements made to Ms. Tiffany Dubois to be null and void." For a heartbeat, there was only silence, a deep, profound silence, in which the judge's words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with brutal intent. Null and void. Two simple words that had just detonated Tiffany Dubois' entire world. Then, the scream. It wasn't a shout of anger or a cry of despair. It was a raw, guttural sound, torn from the deepest part of her being. It was the sound of greed turning to ash, of a meticulously planned future crumbling into dust in a single, devastating instant. It echoed off the wood-panelled walls, a primal howl of thwarted avarice that made Liam and Lily jump and press themselves even closer to Annalise. "No!" Tiffany shrieked, her voice cracking. She surged to her feet, knocking her chair over with a loud clatter. Her lawyer tried to grab her arm, but she shook him off, her face contorted into a mask of pure fury. Her eyes, wild and disbelieving, were locked on Judge Peterson. "That's not possible. He loved me. He promised me everything. We had plans. That thing is a forgery," she screeched, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the will in the judge's hands. Judge Peterson did not flinch. His expression was one of mild boredom, as if he had seen this exact scene play out 100 times before. "Ms. Dubois, the will has been authenticated by 3 separate legal experts from Finnegan & Shaw, the firm that drafted it under Mr. Coleman's direct and repeated supervision. It is ironclad. I suggest you compose yourself." "Compose myself?" She laughed, a hysterical, unhinged sound. "He's giving everything to her, to the little charity case he kicked out of his house like a dog?" Her venomous gaze swung to Annalise. "This is your doing. You manipulated him somehow. You poisoned him against me." Annalise instinctively shielded her children, turning their bodies away from the vitriol being hurled across the room. She was stunned, not by the outburst, but by the sheer, cold-blooded cruelty of Robert's plan. He had built Tiffany up for years, letting her believe she was the heir to his kingdom, only to pull the rug out from under her in the most public and humiliating way possible. This wasn't justice. It was a posthumous spectacle of revenge. "The will does not bequeath the estate to Miss Brennan," the judge corrected Tiffany coolly, his voice cutting through her tirade. Perhaps if you had remained quiet, you would have heard the rest of it. This gave Tiffany a moment's pause. Her eyes narrowed, a desperate, calculating gleam replacing the raw fury. If not Annalise, then who? The judge adjusted his spectacles and continued reading, his voice a steady, unshakable force against the chaos. "With all bequests to Ms. Dubois being voided, I hereby direct the full and complete entirety of my remaining estate, including all liquid assets, all real estate holdings domestic and international, all art and vehicle collections, and most importantly, my 70% controlling interest in Innovate Dynamics, to be placed into a single, irrevocable trust." A trust? Annalise's mind raced. A trust for whom? "This trust," the judge read on, "shall be known as the Coleman Legacy Trust. The sole beneficiaries of this trust are to be my legally recognized children, Liam Coleman and Lily Coleman." Annalise's breath hitched in her throat. Her hand flew to her mouth. $94 million, a controlling stake in a billion-dollar tech company. It wasn't just a safety net. It was an empire that now belonged to her 5-year-old twins. The scale of it was incomprehensible, a number so large it felt like fiction. For 5 years, she had worried about a $300 heating bill, and now her children were, in an instant, wealthier than she could possibly imagine. Tiffany looked as if she had been physically struck. The blood drained from her face, leaving her with a ghastly, pale complexion. She swayed on her feet, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. "But a trust of this magnitude requires a trustee," Judge Peterson continued, his eyes still on the will. "A steward to manage the assets responsibly until the children reach the age of maturity. The choice of a trustee is perhaps the most critical decision a testator can make." He turned a page. The rustle of the paper was like a gunshot in the silent room. "Robert's will was meticulously detailed on this point," the judge stated. He wrote, "I cannot entrust this responsibility to their mother, Annalise Brennan. While I acknowledge her as their caregiver, she has demonstrated a distinct lack of the financial acumen and ruthless pragmatism necessary to navigate the world in which my children must now exist. She is, by her nature, too soft." Annalise felt a familiar sting of the old insult, but it was quickly overshadowed by a wave of fear. If not her, then who? A bank? A faceless corporate entity that would see her children as nothing more than an account number. The thought was terrifying. Tiffany, however, saw a sliver of hope. If Annalise wasn't in control, perhaps there was still a way in. An angle to play. "The will continues," said the judge, "nor can the trustee be anyone associated with my recent business or personal life, as they are, without exception, sycophants and opportunists of the highest order." He paused, letting the insult land. "Therefore I have reached back into my past, to the only man I have ever known whose integrity is absolute and whose judgment is unclouded by greed." The suspense was suffocating. "I hereby name, as the sole trustee of the Coleman Legacy Trust, with full and uncontestable authority over all its assets, my estranged elder brother, Mr. Walter Coleman." A name Annalise hadn't heard in almost 7 years. Walter, Robert's brother. The quiet academic history professor whom Robert had always mocked as Saint Walter, too good for the real world. They had a massive falling out years ago, right after Robert's first major promotion. Walter had despised the man his brother was becoming, and Robert had written him off as a sanctimonious fool. As if on cue, the courtroom doors at the back opened. A tall, grey-haired man in a simple but well-tailored tweed jacket stepped inside. He had the Coleman blue eyes. But where Robert's were chips of ice, this man's were warm and intelligent. He looked around the room, his gaze passing over the apoplectic Tiffany before settling on Annalise and the twins. A gentle, sad smile touched his lips. It was Walter Coleman. Tiffany's last sliver of hope died. She knew who Walter was. She knew he was the one man in the world who was completely immune to her charms, her threats, or her manipulations. He was incorruptible, and he despised everything she and Robert had stood for. This was the final checkmate from the grave. Robert hadn't just disinherited his mistress, he had handed the keys to his kingdom to the one person guaranteed to lock her out forever. The realization broke the last of Tiffany's restraint. "No, no, you can't!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. "That money is mine. I earned it. 6 years of my life. I gave him my youth, my body, everything. I decorated his homes. I hosted his parties. I was the one there, not her." She lunged, not towards the judge, but towards Annalise. Her face was a terrifying vision of hate, her fingers curled into claws. "You bitch! I'll kill you!" The security guard finally jolted into action, intercepted her just as she cleared the aisle. He grabbed her by the arms, but she fought like a cornered animal, kicking and screaming obscenities. "It's mine. He promised me. You all heard him. Tell them!" She shrieked at her lawyer, who could only stand by, helpless and mortified. Judge Peterson banged his gavel, the sound cracking like thunder. "Bailiff, remove Ms. Dubois from my courtroom. Now!" As the guard dragged the struggling, screaming Tiffany towards the exit, she delivered her parting shot, her voice filled with a chilling, desperate venom. "You think you've won? You think you're safe? You and your filthy little brats! This isn't over. I will fight this. I will get what's mine. You hear me? It's mine." The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off the tirade. In the stunning, ringing silence that followed, Annalise Brennan sat frozen, clutching her 2 trembling children, the new, unwilling heirs to a $94 million war. The courtroom doors slammed shut, leaving behind a ringing, profound silence. The aftermath of Tiffany's violent exit hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile decorum of the law. Annalise sat frozen, her arms a protective shield around her children. Her mind was a maelstrom of shock and disbelief. Her children were heirs to an empire, but it was an empire built of spite, a legacy forged in a crucible of revenge. Judge Peterson, looking as if he desperately needed a strong drink, finally broke the silence. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice resonating with authority, "please approach." Walter Coleman walked from the back of the room, his presence a calm island in the turbulent wake of the proceedings. He gave a respectful nod to the judge before his attention settled entirely on Annalise. He knelt, bringing himself to eye level with Liam and Lily, who watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. "Hello there," Walter said, his voice imbued with a kindness that felt foreign in this place. "My name is Walter. I was your father's brother." He offered a small, gentle smile, then looked up at Annalise. "Ms. Brennan, I am so terribly sorry for everything my brother put you through." The sincerity in his expression was a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. "Walter," she managed, the name feeling strange on her tongue after so many years. "I know this is overwhelming," he began. "Robert and I hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. When his lawyers contacted me, I was stunned." "Then why you?" Annalise asked, voicing the question that echoed in her mind. Why did he name you the trustee? Walter's face hardened with a grim understanding. Because I was the only person he knew who couldn't be bought, threatened, or manipulated. He chose me not out of love for me, Annalise, but as the final, perfect weapon against her. He then produced a thick manila envelope. His lawyers gave me this, a letter from Robert. It was to be opened only after the will was read. I believe you deserve to know what it says. He slid the heavy pages from the envelope. Robert's sharp, aggressive handwriting, a familiar, chilling sight. Walter's eyes scanned the first few lines, his jaw tight. It's not an apology, he said grimly. It's a final declaration of purpose. He took a breath and began to read excerpts aloud, his voice giving life to Robert's cold, calculating words. Walter, if you are reading this, I am dead. Don't waste time on sentiment. We both know there was no love lost between us. I've chosen you for this task, not out of familial affection, but for your rigid, infuriating, and, in this one instance, useful morality. Walter paused, shaking his head slightly. Even from the grave he's a charmer, he continued. I am not a fool. The life I led was one of calculated risks, and I knew a sudden end was always a possibility. For years I allowed Tiffany to believe she would be my heir. It was a useful arrangement. Her devotion was transactional, paid for with the illusion of a future inheritance. But recently, her greed became suffocating. She began to see herself as the owner in waiting. I saw her looking at me with the eyes of a vulture. Annalise felt a chill snake down her spine. She could picture it perfectly. Robert, the ultimate predator, realizing he had become the prey. Walter's voice continued, steady and grim. Then I saw a photograph, a candid shot from a charity event in a magazine. In the background, out of focus, was a woman with 2 children. It was Annalise. I hired a private investigator. He gave me a full report, the rundown apartment, the daycare, the freelance work. He also gave me photos of the children. My children. The revelation hit Annalise like a physical blow. She had been watched. Her private, hard-won life had been secretly catalogued and delivered to the man she had escaped. Seeing them, I didn't feel love. Do not mistake this for a deathbed conversion. What I felt was rage. Rage that my bloodline, my DNA, was living in poverty. Rage that the only part of me that would survive was being raised in obscurity. Tiffany would burn through my fortune in a generation. My empire would be a footnote. But my blood could be a dynasty. There it was, the awful, narcissistic truth. This wasn't for Liam and Lily. It was for him. His children were not people to be cherished, but assets to be managed, the living vessels of his monstrous ego. So I devised a final, perfect plan. I would disinherit the vulture and elevate my bloodline. And I would put you, St. Walter, in charge of forging my children into a new, stronger generation of Colemans. Your integrity will protect the money, and your emotional distance will prevent their mother's sentimentality from making them soft. I have left for you a multi-volume set of directives on their education, their investments, their entire lives. You will follow it to the letter. They are my ultimate legacy. Walter stopped reading, his disgust palpable. He folded the letter and put it away, his expression one of finality. The rest is more of the same. Delusions of grandeur from a man who saw his children as his last and best acquisition. He looked directly at Annalise, his gaze unwavering. Now, he said, his voice firm. We ignore this. He tapped the envelope. My brother's demands died with him. The law gives me fiduciary duty as trustee, And that duty is to the well-being of the beneficiaries, not the posthumous whims of their father, and their well-being starts with having a secure, stable, and loving mother. The authority and kindness in his voice were the antithesis of everything Robert represented. My first act as trustee will be to purchase a home for you and the children, wherever you want, a place with a yard and good schools. My second will be to establish a generous living stipend for you, so you never have to work another day unless you choose to. You will raise them with the love and kindness he never understood. I will manage the money, and I will protect all three of you from the world he created. That is my promise. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in Annalise's eyes. They were not tears of sadness or shock, but of overwhelming, bone-deep relief. The fight was over. The constant, grinding struggle that had been her entire existence for 5 years was finally, truly over. She had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, and now someone was offering to help her carry it. "Thank you," she whispered, the two words feeling utterly inadequate to convey the tide of emotion washing over her. "Don't thank me," Walter said, his gaze softening as he looked at the twins, who were watching him with a quiet curiosity. "I'm just doing what my brother should have done a long time ago. I'm taking care of his family." Stepping out of the courthouse, Annalise felt the world shift on its axis. The city noise, once a source of anxiety, now sounded like a hopeful symphony. The weight she had carried alone for 5 long years began to lift, not because of the staggering sum of money, but because the truth was finally free. Walter Coleman was true to his word, becoming a quiet, steady guardian for her and the twins. He decisively rejected Robert's cruel, posthumous instruction manual for the children's lives, stating firmly that his duty was to their happiness, not to a dead man's ego. Security was provided with swift efficiency. Annalise chose a beautiful home in a quiet town with a sprawling backyard, and a generous stipend ensured she would never again have to choose between paying for rent and buying groceries. Her days of relentless struggle were over. As Annalise began to build their new life, Tiffany Dubois' world crumbled. Her desperate legal challenges to the will were systematically dismantled in court, collapsing against the diabolically perfect plan Robert had engineered. Her final appeal was dismissed, leaving her in financial ruin, a cautionary tale in the society pages she once dominated. But Annalise had no interest in the world Tiffany lost. Her newfound security was a tool, not an identity. She established a charitable foundation in Miss Gable's name to provide struggling single mothers with the resources she never had. With her time finally her own, she rediscovered her passion for art, pouring years of pain, resilience, and hope onto canvases. A local gallery, struck by the raw emotion in her work, offered her a solo exhibition. On the morning of the opening, she stood watching Liam and Lily chase each other across the sun-drenched lawn, their laughter the only sound in the peaceful air. Walter, who had become the loving, grandfatherly figure they deserved, sat on the porch, smiling. In that moment, Annalise understood the profound truth of her journey. The money hadn't saved her. It had simply arrived after she had already saved herself. Robert's will wasn't a gift, but a final, unintended verdict confirming a victory she had already won. Her real legacy wasn't the Coleman fortune. It was the 2 happy, thriving children before her, raised not by their father's cold ambition, but by their mother's unbreakable love. And so, Annalise Brennan's story isn't just about a dramatic courtroom showdown or a shocking will. It's a testament to the incredible resilience of a mother's love and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be broken. She faced betrayal and abandonment, but built a world for her children on a foundation of pure grit and determination. The fortune they inherited was not their true inheritance. Their mother's fighting spirit was. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest victories aren't about getting revenge, but about surviving long enough to build a new, better life on the ashes of the old one. What did you think of Robert's final, twisted plan? Was it a form of justice, or just one last act of supreme selfishness? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life drama.